recording?
Professor, before starting, I have a
Yes,
question.
sir.
So, did you extend our discussion
Yes,
for 2 chapters?
yes.
So, when did you do it?
I'll be giving you a couple of days. I haven't gotten chapter 22 up yet, so I'll be giving you a couple of days for
So
that.
until next class or until
Until
the
next
week?
class, yes,
Okay.
until
So
next
we have,
class.
So
Yeah.
we have time. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, because I will not get to the end of that chapter today. Okay, thanks for reminding me.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, have you got you should have the slides, revolutions and nation building. So I'll have to get into what's going to happen in 1848. But I had it. All right. Ah, there it is. That's why I couldn't find it. Okay, wrestling around with technology. So, all of the corn laws, the reform bills, the revolts and revolutions of the 1830s, all of this is going to lead to a particular year, and that is the year 1848. There are a handful of years that you should know about because so many things happened. This is one of those years. There will be revolutions throughout Europe that are going to be extremely meaningful, trying to move to more liberalism, trying to move to more republics or constitutional monarchies, and each and every one of them is going to fail. So, spectacularly. So, several of the people involved in that old Congress of Vienna, that's going to be falling apart. Von Metternich, who represented Austria, and King Louis Philippe, a new king of France. They will be forced to leave their countries in a hurry because of the revolutions happening there. Marx and Engels will publish in that year the Communist Manifesto, and I did talk last Tuesday, my 5-minute Marx explanation, way overly simplified, but hopefully you kind of get the idea so that when I say terms like class struggle, you kind of understand what I'm talking about. There will be a group of political movements that had started at the end of the 18th century, things that had been put in place because of the French Revolution. Those are going to have their last hurrah and then be basically crushed. And so it is an end of a revolutionary moment, 50 plus years, in which Europe could have gone in one direction, and it doesn't. So I spoke a little bit about nationalism on Tuesday and the ideology of liberalism. They go together early on because the early idea of a nation is as a sovereign people. What do I mean about sovereign? They have their own culture, they have their own language, they have their own uh, sometimes ethnicity, sometimes they are united by religion, but not always. They have a geographical boundary, and they think of themselves as being citizens of that area, not subjects of a king. So this idea of the nation being this imagined community of people who agree to be in this community. This dovetails beautifully with that classic liberalism I talked about on Tuesday, that the idea that individual rights are the most important, the idea that a constitution should be the guarantee of those natural individual rights, and that the government could only be legitimate if it reflected that. So liberalism and nationalism dovetailed for the first 60, 70 years after the French Revolution had started. But with the failures coming up in 1848, bye-bye, it's going to change. It's going to change radically. And the ideas, the basic liberal ideas, classical liberal ideas, are going to go by the wayside. Nationalism is going to win the day, but it is going to be taken up by a completely different group. That is a weird bit of alchemy that's going to happen to the ideas of nationalism. All of a sudden, a whole bunch of people who did not believe nationalism to be a good thing are going to embrace it. So the revolutions of 1848, there were economic reasons. There was the potato famines going on in Germany and Ireland. There were poor crop yields in the years of 1840 to 1848. That's why they called them the Hungry 40s. And there were lots of social antagonisms, these new classes, the working class, the proletariat, and the bourgeois class, those that own the means of production, and the middle class, the professionals. They're all going to try to be getting the attention of those people who are in true power, such as the Parliament in Great Britain. They'll be sending them lists of grievances, political grievances, such as the Chartist movement. That will come to a head at this. And nationalism, as an expression of an independent people, is going to be extremely important in Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe. All areas, by the way, that are under the control of various great powers, either under the control of France or Russia or the Austrian Empire. And so we see a rise in all of these different language groups. The people of Hungary, the people of Poland, the people of the Czech lands, the people of Slovenia, the people of Croatia. All these different groups that have their own languages, that have their own culture, they see themselves as ethnically different than the people who are ruling them. And so consequently, nationalism is going to be a reaction against these occupiers. So the ideas of getting a representative government, ending the privilege that had been the prerogative of the elites for hundreds of years, the lords of the manor, so to speak, those feudal traditions, The classic liberals wanted to end those, and opening up the economy, changing it from a mercantile system to a more laissez-faire free market system, so that goods can travel freely and be sold wherever they can get the best price, which is a guarantor of people actually making money rather than just a handful that have a privilege or a monopoly to make money. And part of how these classical liberal revolts are going to gain support, national unity. They are going to make people aware of the fact that they are of this group by encouraging the use of languages, by theatrical performances, by newspapers, by books. All of these things I talked about Tuesday are going to be vehicles for these revolutions. France, after Napoleon, is going to have to go through multiple different governments. They will be mainly monarchies, and eventually they will have something of a republic by the middle of the 1840s, and they will elect a president. And the man they elect as president is named Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. He is Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew and a real classy dresser. Anyway, he is a man who appealed to the conservatives, but he ran his campaign as a revolutionary. So he is able and is talking to both sides, the conservatives and the liberals. He will gain quite a bit of power by reasserting the powers of the Catholic Church over areas such as education. Once he takes power, however, he is going to ban all sorts of radical activities. He's going to ban political meetings. He is going to get rid of press freedoms so that opposing political parties and opposing ideals cannot print their ideas and send them out. Eventually, by about 1851, he calls a plebiscite. It's a stupidly difficult word to pronounce. Plebiscite is a chance for everyone who is qualified to vote on a single issue. And the issue Louis Napoleon Bonaparte puts forward is that should the Constitution of France be changed? And he wins. Plebiscites are interesting little election tools. We don't see them in the United States. We saw one in Great Britain a couple of years ago. If you keep up with the news, if you've heard of Brexit, where the British ran a plebiscite to that, and their question was, should we stay in the European Union or should we leave it? And those people who wanted to leave won the majority of votes. And that is as direct a will of the people as you can get. Needless to say, there's all sorts of political ramifications for it. But putting these issues up for everyone to vote on is both powerful and dangerous, because if you win a very large vote, you have a mandate, meaning you have now a responsibility, and it's got legitimacy and power because a large group of people voted for it. But Louis Napoleon Bonaparte is going to take the advantage of winning this plebiscite to basically create the Second French Empire. His uncle created the first French Empire. He's creating the second, and he will declare himself Napoleon III, Emperor of France. There had been briefly Napoleon's, I think it's brother or son had named himself Napoleon II, but had only ruled for a minuscule amount of time. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, or Napoleon III, will rule for a considerable time, exert considerable power, and change France in a couple of very important ways. So he is a crucial figure. Moving away from France, which, as we see at the end of the 1840s, beginning of the 1850s, France has gone back to becoming an empire, the rule of a single emperor. So let's take the ideas of the revolution and squish them up into a little ball and throw them over our shoulder, because France is an empire now. Now, Germany, or the German lands. Probably if you took 101, every instructor, and I know I'm the most very guilty of it myself, would say in Germany, and then they'd probably stop themselves and say, in the German lands, or the area we now call Germany, because there was no single unified Germany. It was a confederation of dukedoms and earldoms and principalities and little kingdoms, and this mess of little tiny small properties ruled by warlords, lords, kings, etc. Mandrakes and anyway, so this German lands had been this way throughout most of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and it even is at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. The Congress of Vienna is basically going to say, hey, let's create this German confederation. And it was a very large confederation because they included Vienna, or Austria, and Prussia into it as well. Now, all of these different groups speak a Germanic language, but in a very different way than each other. A German speaker in Strasbourg sounds totally different than a German speaker in Vienna, who sounds different than a German speaker in Berlin, who sounds different than a German speaker in Munich. They could all pretty much understand each other because they could all speak a language known as Hauptdeutsch, or High German, which is the language basically that becomes kind of the language for all the German speakers, mainly because it is the language that Martin Luther, back in 1520-something, translated the Bible into Hauptdeutsch. And so that kind of cemented this language as the one language they all shared. But as I say, they sounded very differently from one another. And the problem, so these areas were tied together by a language or a language group. They were not tied together at all by religion, because a good chunk of this area was Catholic, and some large chunks of this area were very stoutly Lutheran or Protestant. But they are contiguous We have that going for them. And they do share a few cultural things, not a lot. And there's a problem with making this giant confederation that includes Prussia, which is this blue area and this blue area right here. Yes, it is a non-contiguous state, meaning that they don't meet, their borders don't meet. So the same guy who rules this area rules this area as well. And then we have the Austrian Empire ruled by the Habsburgs. And this is the Prussians and the Austrians for much of history had not gotten along that well. So what will happen during the course of this 40 some odd years that there's this German Confederation is that they will decide that classical liberalism is the way to go. And so they're going to decide to hold an assembly. They vote for 800 delegates. Most of these delegates are doctors, lawyers, professors, the professional classes. Very few of them were working class, and only a handful were very rich. Most of them were very moderate liberals. In other words, they were classical liberals, but they did not believe in revolution as a way to get to it. That's why they're having an assembly. They believe that the way to get to a representative government is have an assembly, write a constitution, and work with it within the laws. Moderate progress within the limits of the laws. So they wanted a unified Germany. Why so? A lot of it is economic reasons. All of those little boundary lines, anytime you wanted to get a good something across those boundary lines, you had to stop, it had to be inspected, you had to pay tolls, or licenses or fees, and then you could go on your way. And that slows everything down. It makes everything more expensive. Better to have a large area with none of these interior borders. That was kind of the idea behind forming the European Union in the 1990s. Was to create this large area that didn't have these interior borders. I lived in Prague in 1992 and 93, and we would travel. This is before the European Union, so every time you would get to a border, and we traveled a lot by train, the train would stop, the customs officials would come on, check everybody's ticket, look at everybody's passport, the dogs would come through and sniff your luggage. And when you're traveling through a lot of little countries, you just, it was a pain. It slowed everything down. With no interior borders, goods, services, and people move much more easily. But there was a question for this assembly that they wanted to solve, because they got together, and rather than jumping right on, let's write a constitution and let's get it going, they started arguing this bizarre question. Do they want the great Germany or a small Germany? And the basic difference was, do they want a nation of Germany with Austria? That would be the great Germany. Or do they want a smaller nation without Austria? Because Austria shares language and quite a bit of customs with them. But that would raise an issue because Austria already has an emperor. And so the Frankfurt Assembly, by having Austria in this greater Germany, would all of a sudden be subsumed under the rule of the Austrian emperor, which is something they did not necessarily want because he outranked everybody else. So they decided to not bring in Austria. They accepted the small Germany solution to get rid of the Habsburgs, the ruling family of Austria. And they wrote up a constitution that created basically a constitutional monarchy. And the monarch that they decided would be the proper monarch for this area would be the King of Prussia, Friedrich William IV. So instead of just ruling Prussia, he was going to be ruling all of the German lands in one kingdom. Problem was, he was an authoritarian figure who was already king, and when the Frankfurt Assembly respectfully offered him the crown of Germany, this new state that they had created, he basically told them that he would not accept a crown from the gutter. The idea that he was the King of Prussia by some sort of divine right made his already existing crown something that is very powerful. But with all of these common people saying, we want you as our king, here is the crown, Frederick William weighed the possibilities and did not want to be beholden to a constitutional assembly. He wanted to rule as an autocrat. So this constitution is not going to happen. And he was at a position of considerable strength. He's a king. He has hard power, whereas the Frankfurt Assembly had a little bit of soft power. Guess who won? The assembly was broken up partially because some of the representatives were now feeling as if this is a problem, and Frederick William had kind of hinted at possibilities of violence to get rid of this assembly. And so the idea of classical liberal constitution-based government in Germany, it's gone. And many of the delegates had to flee the country. Frederick William was hunting them down, and many of them left and came to the United States. My husband has a family member that was one of these delegates that had to leave. He was someone who supported the liberal ideals and had to get out of these German lands very quickly. However, there was a popular revolution at this moment. A lot of the people who had come to the Frankfurt Assembly had been professionals, they had been businessmen, they were people of a certain stature. But the peasants did not want to let up with this idea of we want Germany to be united. And so they're going to start a physical revolution. They're going to ransack tax offices. Professor Griffiths, I think it's my 7th or 8th law of surviving Western civilization is, during a revolt, ransack the tax offices, burn those tax records so they cannot tax you again. Anyway, I'm joking. That the budding industries of Germany, the revolution is going to hit them, and the workers are going to be smashing machines in order to protest. There's going to be political clubs who are going to produce newspapers and citizen militias. The German areas will have start a tradition of citizen militias that are linked to political groups. And these are armed militias. They are not government run, they are run by the political groups. This is a tradition that's going to be how Adolf Hitler comes to power in the 1930s, less than 100 years after this revolution.
So I have a question.
Yes, sir.
He was the king?
Who was the king? Frederick William.
Oh, he was
Frederick William.
he was a Arab king?
He was the king of Prussia, but he had connections with all the rest of the princes and kings. The German lands had quite a few different rulers at this moment. There was not a single king over them. So in order, you're welcome. In order to keep the peace, in order to tamp down this, this growing revolt, the rulers of all of these small kingdoms and principalities and dukedoms realized that the national ideas, the nationalist ideas for the peasants and many other people were stronger than the classical liberal concepts of constitution and laissez-faire economics and individual rights. So the rulers are going to take up the mantle of nationalism, take it away from the liberals, and take it upon themselves. You can't be a good citizen of I can't remember that one area's name. Okay, you cannot be a good Bavarian, which is the area around Munich, if you want constitutions and republics and that. If you want to be a good Bavarian, you support your king. And so that's how the alchemy of nationalism moves from being the purview of the liberals to moving way over to the right and being a way of unifying these areas. So there's no particular ideology that can claim sole possession of nationalism, but nationalism still is an extraordinarily strong driving force that different political sides or ideologies can use. So there's going to be revolts throughout Germany. There will be revolts in the Habsburg Empire. There will be revolts in Poland. There will be revolts in Prague. And of course in France. And the idea of the classic liberals, who were mainly the people fomenting these revolts, are going to be the ones who are going to be fighting in those revolts and sadly losing out. But the term that is used for most of these revolts, or this idea that in 1848 everybody had this revolt. They call it the springtime of the peoples. The idea that the people are waking up and wanting to rule themselves. And this collapses spectacularly. But the idea of spring of the peoples is an idea that sticks when we move forward with certain movements. Oh, I forgot to plug in. When I move, okay. So okay, springtime of the peoples. So the idea of the spring as in a new set of consciousness for people is going to become kind of a watchword, kind of a term that's used. In 1968, we will have the Prague Spring. In the in 2000, I'm hesitating on the date because I don't remember exactly, but recently we've had the Twitter revolution in Iran and the Arab Spring, or when the old leader of Egypt, Mubarak, was overthrown, along with there would be a Arab Spring in Tunisia, etc. So the idea of spring is a kind of a political shorthand for people overthrowing a government and trying to take over. So James asks, the Tsars leaned on the idea of himself as the little father of all Slavs, great father being God of the Eastern Orthodox conception, who justify their station around this time, right? Exactly right, James. I'm going to be getting to that in a moment. Pan-Slavism is going to be part of this movement as well. So yeah. Yeah, I didn't know that he called himself the little father because the great father being God. Okay, so the Tsar is putting himself next to God. Well, okay. Thank you for bringing that up. All right. In fact, we're going to talk about it right now, or start to get into it. So, the people of the German lands, they excluded the Habsburg Empire from their idea of Germany. But the Habsburgs had their own situation. See, the Habsburgs had done a lot of conquering, especially the 30 Years' War, and a little bit before that. They also had a particularly powerful empress by the name of Maria Theresa, who had a huge number of children. And these children were all married off to royal families throughout Europe. And so that's why you had, in bringing into the Habsburg fold, the Austrian fold, a whole bunch of different kingdoms or areas. The Germans, the Czechs, the Magyars, which is a term for the Hungarians, Poles, Slovaks, Serbs, Italians. A couple of things that these groups had in common. They were under the control of the Habsburg Empire, and most of them were very strongly Roman Catholic. But starting in the 19th century, we will see many of these language groups, many of these groups start to assert themselves as independent cultures. This is the nationalistic movement again. That, for example, the Czechs had been ruled by the Habsburgs since the 30 Years' War in 1624. And the Czechs have a Slavic-based language. They are Slavs. But that language was not taught in the schools. It was a language that became used as a peasant language. Peasants talked to each other in Czech, but if you were in a big city and involved in business in any way, you spoke German. During this nationalistic movement, there's going to be a handful of thinkers who are going to say, let's start speaking Czech. Well, they had to dig up the language. They had to find written materials that had been written before 1624, and they had to basically give it a grammar so that other people could learn it. Meanwhile, they're also writing poems in Czech. They're creating plays in Czech. They are writing operas and music with Czech words, and writing novels and writing histories about famous Czechs. In other words, these traditions had to be found, massaged, turned into something concrete, and then shared with everybody. So it's not simple just to say, we're all Czechs. It had to be developed. And so you get enough of those kinds of people doing this throughout the Habsburg Empire, and you get an empire that is really on the cusp of falling apart because you've got so many independent groups. If you were in the officer corps of the Austrian military, you had to be able to give your orders in something like 18 different languages. You didn't have to learn the whole languages, but you had to be able to give orders in that many languages. It was very confusing. The Austrians, however, had a parliament, and a lot of these different areas had representatives in the parliament. And they would try to push forward laws to allow for the teaching of certain languages, etc. So they will only be marginally successful. Your book claims that the nationalist sentiment was strongest among Polish aristocrats. That is very hard to measure. Nationalistic sentiment, that is. It was equally as strong among the Czechs and definitely among the Magyars, the Hungarians. The Hungarians had their own claim. It is going to be pushed by a small Magyar aristocracy, rich men from Hungary, or the Hungarian region, who also made up the bulk of the officer corps in the Habsburg military. And so they're going to be able to throw their weight around better than most of these other groups who only have elected officials. But if you're an empire, you depend on your military and you have to make them happy. And so the Hungarian nationalists are going to be much more successful in creating their own national identity and becoming somewhat independent, or at least codependent, on the Habsburg Empire. But here you go, James. One of the people who is taking an interest in what's happening in the Austrian Empire are the people who were kind of at times at odds with the Habsburg lands, and those were the Russians. And the Tsar and many Russian thinkers are going to be encouraging the idea after about 1850 of pan-Slavism, because way back in history, I'm talking several thousand years back in history, the Slavs were basically one people that moved out into different areas. They share a language group. It's a Slavic language group. The Russians, the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Slovenes, the Croats, Serbs, Macedonians, and Bulgarians all speak Slavic languages. However, not all of these Slavic languages use the Cyrillic alphabet. Remember, the Russians had no alphabet when St. Cyril and Methodius get there around 800 CE, and so they give the Russians a modified Greek alphabet. Russians don't speak Greek, they just use pretty much the same letters. And in fact, this is a banner from a convention, a pan-Slavic convention that was held in Russia. They invited many, many important people to come and talk. And the badge, of course, has the Russian flag on it. They should have figured that one out. And it's got a depiction of St. Cyril and St. Methodius, the men who were responsible for bringing Christianity to the Slavs. And it basically I cannot read it. I wish I could. There's only a couple words in there I can read. Anyway, so the little father of the Slavic people, the Tsar, is going to make a big deal about this. He's going to bring together historians. He's going to pay for them to come to these conventions. They're going to be talking a lot about pan-Slavism and how wonderful it is. And then the Russians decide that, yes, we're going to make a movement to do all of this. And by the way, we're going to insist that everybody goes back to speaking Russian. And the idea of the Russians wanting to basically create a hegemony over all of these Slavic lands to people who had been under the Austrian Empire all this time, all of a sudden being under the Russian Empire does not sound that different. They want to be their own independent lands. So it was very clear that the Russians wanted hegemony, is the proper term, over these groups. And so many of them just dropped the idea of pan-Slavism. Now, it's going to come back with a vengeance after World War II, but we'll get to that in a couple weeks, because this is very important. This pan-Slavism will work into the Soviet Union and all the satellite countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia. All of these countries that I'm talking about, many of them become satellite states of the old Soviet Union. So the Russians do not give up the idea of pan-Slavism. So after 1848, excuse me, we're going to see actual building of nation states. That is, nation as in a group of people in a similar-minded community, and a state, which is the power apparatus that runs these communities. And we're going to see new governments, not just new governments, but new nation states arise where they had not been unified before. But the people using the nationalistic ideals are going to be the conservatives, that they're going to be basically using nationalism to unify these groups, but to gain support for their ideals. So, as I said before, liberalism had been seen as as being pro-nationalist. Now we're seeing the conservatives, because after the failures of 1848, the liberals are going to be seen as revolutionary and violent and rebellious, and who wants to be around them? So those people who want a more ordered and secure future are going to look for the conservatives to make that happen, not the liberals. So here's a map of all of the different languages that are spoken in Central and Eastern Europe. And some of them are very close to each other. Some of them are influenced by areas outside of them. And there's a lot of overlap in these areas. And there were a lot of people who could speak multiple languages. So it wasn't just you crossed a border and all of a sudden, boom, people only spoke this language. If you go to places like Strasbourg, which is in the very western part of what we now know as Germany, everything's in French and in German. And the people go between the two languages quite easily. So, the Italian peninsula is where I'm going to start. The unification of the Italian peninsula will, in essence, start as a movement from the bottom up. In other words, it's going to be common people, peasants, and the middle class who are going to work towards a unified nation that they can think of as Italy. Italy had not been unified since it had been under the Romans. So we're talking, it hadn't been unified since the year 472. So definitely, it had been split for quite a bit of time. But one political thinker named Giuseppe Mazzini is going to get this idea of maybe they could unify the entire Italian peninsula. He had been a member of the Carbonari, that was the group that opposed the Congress of Vienna, and he starts a society called Young Italy in 1831. This preface, young, becomes attached to all sorts of different movements, but it's generally a term that is used to represent classical liberalism, these people who are going to move to a single ideal, Young Italy. You've probably heard the term Young Turks. The Young Turks under Kemal in the 1917 They will form a political party, call themselves the Young Turks after Mazzini's example of Young Italy. Mazzini will have a very brief career trying to create a fighting force to take over Sardinia, and then from there get more adherents and launch an army and take over all of the Italian peninsula. He is sadly not going to be able to succeed, and he will be forced into exile and spend most of the rest of his life in England. And he will spend that time writing letters to as many people as he can, encouraging them to work towards an Italian nation and an Italian state. Mazzini, as far as his political outlook, was very, very strongly Republican. He did not want a constitutional monarchy. He wanted an entirely elected representative government, and he fought very, very hard for that. Another member of Young Italy who is also going to fight in Sardinia, lose, and then be exiled, is Giuseppe Garibaldi. Garibaldi, I'm not sure what he did before the revolution, but he will fight in Sardinia, lose, and then be exiled. He will end up in South America and work to help to liberate the countries of South America. He will be working with Simón de Bolívar. While he's in South America, he adopts South American clothing. This is a image of him. That is a poncho, and he always wore a red shirt, and he wore gaucho pants and boots. And Giuseppe Mazzini might have been the intellectual mover, philosopher, if you will, of Italian unification. Giuseppe Garibaldi was the physical manifestation of the guy charging in with the saber. Now, he wanted unification through popular movement, meaning that he wanted to start a revolution and he wanted the people to go in and fight. But unlike Mazzini, he was willing to accept a constitutional monarchy. He was a bit more moderate in terms of how he wanted the state to be created. So that's Garibaldi. He is basically one of the great famous revolutionaries because he will be eventually successful. And he had quite a bit of renown. He was also a very charismatic and splashy individual. But there's going to be a political insider that is going to be helping Mazzini and Garibaldi. Because remember, for some of this time, neither Mazzini nor Garibaldi could be in the Italian peninsula. So this political insider, Count Camillo Benso di Cavour, is going to work to make a constitutional monarchy on the Italian peninsula. He is the prime minister to Victor Emmanuel II, the king of Piedmont, Sardinia. So this is the island of Sardinia and Piedmont, which is an area on the very north end of the Italian boot. Most of it now is in France. Anyway, so de Cavour is going to be working from above. in political circles with laws and regulations and using soft power to basically work towards a united Italy, because the Italian peninsula was ruled over by multiple different factions. Part of it was the Papal States, some of it belonged to France, some of it belonged to Austria. So it was quite divided up between multiple groups. So de Cavour is going to work from Piedmont, Sardinia, to try to not just unify Italy, but promote economic expansion and the modern transportation infrastructure and bring Italy kicking and screaming out of the 16th century, 17th century into a more modern nation. So we have these two men, Garibaldi, who wanted revolution from below, unification from below, and de Cavour, who wanted unification from above. So it took both of these men. Meanwhile, Mazzini is writing letters and encouraging this, but saying, but we don't want a king. We want a republic. So Mazzini is kind of at odds with de Cavour and is very unhappy with Garibaldi. So here's the Kingdom of Sardinia, this green area. This is the Piedmont area, Savoy, etc. And we see all of the different areas that Italy is broken up into. So in 1860, this is 12 years after 1848, 1860, Garibaldi starts collecting an army, starts arming them, and decides that he's going to start way down in Sicily. That's the deflated soccer ball that the boot of Italy is kicking. He's going to bring his army. Obviously, he's got support from the Kingdom of Sardinia and de Cavour, which is probably why Garibaldi was willing to have a constitutional monarchy, because he's being funded by the Kingdom of Sardinia. Anyway, he is going to land on Sicily, which I believe was a French colony, I'm not sure. Anyway, he is going to land and start collecting more fighters with him and start marching across Sicily and then up the boot towards Rome. Marching towards Rome, if you remember 101 at all, an army marching towards Rome meant big things were in the works. There's a lot of big changes that happen in the history of the Italian peninsula when an army marches on Rome. So here's Garibaldi. He's got a small group, his 1,000 heroes, and they are going to attempt to take Sicily. So Garibaldi is going to be bringing his troops onto Sicily. Meanwhile, de Cavour is cultivating an alliance with France to get rid of the Austrians. And so he ends up starting a war with Austria, because Austria controlled quite a few areas. In Sicily, Garibaldi lands with his thousands, and of course the army grows, but Garibaldi has to take Sicily in a very spectacular way because he doesn't have a lot of arms. And the troops that are in Sicily are fairly well armed. And so Garibaldi, in his very charismatic and swashbuckling way, does a bayonet charge uphill. I mean, this is Gettysburg, bayonets sort of stuff. the idea of a bayonet charge is frightening enough, and they are rarely, if ever, successful, because you've got bayonets and swords and sharp pointy sticks, and they have guns. But uphill is certain death. If you've ever tried to run uphill, you know what I'm talking about. So Garibaldi, very gutsy, draws his sword, gets his 1,000, and they charge uphill to take a fortification. And it totally unnerves the soldiers who are on top of the hill, and they throw down their guns and run. Because they're not going to deal with these crazy people. And so Garibaldi starts having these fantastic, spectacular victories as he's moving across Sicily, and he takes Sicily, and he topples the kingdom of Francis II, who was the ruler of Sicily, and he starts marching on Rome, issuing demands as he's going. So Cavour was a little bit worried that Garibaldi is going to be making either the French or the Austrians mad enough that they would really launch a giant war and crush this small kingdom of Sardinia. He wanted to basically do it through legal means. But Garibaldi wants to do it with a lot of splash and elan, with bayonet charges and marches on Rome, etc. The king of Sardinia, de Cavour's boss, basically contacts Garibaldi and says, let's lay low with the violence, and I will consent to be your king. And so Victor Emmanuel II, who was king of Sardinia, all of a sudden becomes king of Italy and rules quite well for 17 years. There are still many areas on the Italian peninsula that are in the hands of Austrians. That they're going to lose, the Austrians are going to lose that in a war with Prussia. It's getting confusing, I'm sorry. The Italian soldiers are finally going to get to Rome and occupy it. And then Rome becomes the capital of the Italian kingdom. Of course, Mazzini, who is still alive, is not that happy that a king has taken over, but he is happy that there are fewer and fewer other kingdoms in Italy, and it's becoming one place. Problem was, Italy had been broken up for so long that culturally they were kind of different, and very few people spoke Italian as Mazzini spoke it, and other people had spoken it. It's like less than 5%. So a very small group of people spoke this language. So it wasn't a matter of unification by language. It was just kind of we're all on the same peninsula, and we had all been under Roman control 1400 years before. Because the two cultures, the cultures in Italy are markedly different even today. If we think of Italian products, we think of those great cars, Maseratis, Lamborghinis, and high-tech stuff. That's all Northern Italy. That's all made in Milan and Florence and Venice and all those areas up north. Down south tends to be rural, area around Naples. It's a very different planet. Milan is not comparable to Naples. It just isn't. They're very different places. Also, even though they have become a kingdom, they're still not a very even, equitable arrangement for peasants, agricultural workers, and the people who actually own the land. So Italy had to fight mainly from the bottom up, but also from the top down to become a nation state. And then they had to go through the hard work of actually turning themselves all into Italians. They had to teach everybody Italian. They had to unify all this. So it was a very long and difficult haul. So what time is it? Okay. So that's Italy. So when you're thinking about Italy, think of bottom up, some top down, but it eventually becomes a constitutional monarchy. The German lands, a very different process. The unification of Germany is top down, unquestionably. And it starts with the King of Prussia, William I, Wilhelm I. The book says William, and translated it's William, but I'm going to make the mistake of calling him Wilhelm. Sorry about that. So William I builds his army and is not happy with the fact that he's kind of stuck with a parliament. So he basically wants to drive a wedge between himself and his desire for power and the parliament that wants to control things like the budget. And the parliament is afraid that the king is going to have an army, and what is he going to do with it? Maybe get rid of parliament. They're a little bit nervous about that. So King William of Prussia decides to hire a man who he thinks can accomplish this huge task of breaking William away from the parliament. And that man is Bismarck. He is named the Minister President of Prussia. It's a weird role. In parliamentary countries, they have a president and they have a prime minister. And in some countries, the president is a figurehead and the prime minister has all the power. And in other countries, the president has the power and the prime minister just kind of runs parliament. So it depends. Bismarck, under King William I, was given both jobs and basically did not hesitate to carry out William I's wishes. So Otto von Bismarck, one of the most important men in Europe, he is going to be responsible for a lot of very interesting things happening. Otto von Bismarck was from a somewhat wealthy family. They were landholders in Prussia, and those that class of men who were landholders in Prussia were called Junkers. It's spelled Junkers, but it's pronounced Junkers. And that meant that they held land. The von in his name signifies that. However, as a young man, he was a mess as far as drinking and horseplay and all sorts of things. But once he gets married, he cleans himself up and looks to become an army officer, because many of the Junkers were the army officer, the officer corps of the Prussian army. He also defended the monarchy because he knew that his position depended on the monarchy. If Prussia was to go like a republic, he would have no more job. And he would not have the privileges that he was enjoying as a Junker and as a very high-ranking official and military man. So he opposed republics and liberalism, but he was a Prussian through and through. In other words, he is this new combination of conservative and nationalist. He wanted to unify Germany. That was his idea. Also, King William I wanted to unify Germany. But this was not happening after 1848. But when Bismarck takes control in the 1860s, he sees his opportunity to do this. Bismarck practiced something known as realpolitik. This is an important concept in politics. It is the institution of what is possible. In other words, let's not have any highfalutin ideas about, individual rights and doing all these things that are morally good or intellectually sound or very diplomatic. Realpolitik was basically, let's do whatever we need to do to get our end. So it's in some ways very Machiavellian. And I hope you remember good old Machiavelli from History 101. Anyway, Bismarck will not be at all interested in listening to Parliament. He is basically going to shove them aside and take over and try to unify Germany for his king, William I. Bismarck famously said that Germany will never be unified by a piece of paper, but by Blut und Eisen, blood and iron. He was a warrior through and through. But his goal is to unite all of these different areas: Bavaria, Westphalia, Brandenburg, Silesia, etc. This would be his goal, even up into Denmark. And of course, Prussia is way over here, bordering on Poland. So how to unite these groups? They were not united in terms of religion. The South was extremely Catholic. The North was very Lutheran. And basically, Bismarck is going to kind of look at all of these areas and figure out what it's going to take to bring them into the fold. And if it takes starting a war, so be it. But he doesn't want it to look like he started the war. And so he's going to do some of the weirdest things to get people to attack him. And he knows that he has one of the best trained armies in Europe at this time. They also have a secret weapon that at the time, only a handful of countries knew about it or were producing it. Prussia was producing it, and this is called the needle gun. We know it as a breech loading gun, meaning that almost every other army in Europe was using a gun, a muzzle loading gun. that you had to get the the gun up straight, and you put the put the put the gunpowder in, put the bullet in, put the wad in, rammed it home. And it takes various steps. And we talked, I think it was Tuesday, about how you could get 3 shots a minute if you were very, very good. The needle gun, you don't have to put the gun down. You're loading it from the breech, which is right in front of your face. Now, they didn't have large magazines. They didn't have, couldn't hold a lot of bullets. It was loaded individually. The needle part was that the bullet was actually in a cartridge casing, so that everything was self-contained in the bullet, and that the gun had hammered in what was in essence a needle or a pin that set the cartridge off. And then you got rid of the brass casing of the cartridge, put another cartridge in. But it meant you could fire quite a few more rounds much more quickly. You could use a completely different type of bullet, which did a lot more damage. And you didn't have to stand up. You could lie down and shoot, meaning that you didn't have to open up your physical body to getting shot like everybody else in Europe had to. This is a distinct advantage. Also, Prussia was very good about arming a lot of their troops with this. So, aside from technological advancements, Bismarck is going to basically use that nationalism that the conservatives have to basically get other parts of the German Confederation on his side. He downplayed Austria, especially in those areas that were not Roman Catholic. And Austria had a considerable amount of sway over many of the German lands, and he's going to basically try to drive a wedge. There will be a dispute about territories at the Schleswig and Holstein area, which is up into Denmark. And he's going to get the Danish king to attack that area, and Bismarck is going to be saving that area. He's going to get some Austrians to help him, but he's going to take over that area. They're going to win the war. So Austria had nominal control over this area, the Schleswig-Holstein area, and when the Prussians basically beat back the Danish, they're going to have to give up that area. Eventually, the Bismarck will be able to attack parts of Vienna, and Vienna is going to lose quite badly and have to start giving up land. And part of that land goes to Prussia, and another part of that land, Venice, is going to go to the Italians. That's how the Italians end up with the area around Venice. There's still a handful of areas on the northern Italian peninsula that the Italians and the Austrians are still fighting over, but they're pretty small areas. Anyway, so Bismarck is just kind of starting this steamroller that's going to be rolling over these German confederations. But his real genius is a few years later with the Franco-Prussian War. The Bismarck idealizes that, hey, if he could get in a war with France, then he could really get all of the Germans on the side of Prussia. And so Bismarck starts this letter writing campaign and some telegraphs that he makes sure that the French see over this dispute of the Hohenzollerns to occupy the Spanish throne going back, 100 years. I mean, it is one of these difficult treaty sort of things that Bismarck is going to take advantage of. And this is going to get France to declare war on Prussia. And when France declares war on Prussia, the South German states don't want to be on France's side. They want to be on Prussia's side. So basically, Bismarck gets the Southern German states just because they want to join into this war too. No other European power is going to help France. And so the Prussian army just mows over the French army. Now, at this moment, France is ruled by, of course, Emperor Napoleon III, Napoleon's nephew. And this Napoleon III, thinks of himself as being a brilliant tactician, just like his uncle. And he wants to go to the front to lead the troops. This is a very bad mistake because the Prussians outmatch the French army, and the French army loses in the city of Sedan in September of 1870. But worse than that, Bismarck and his army captures the French king, Napoleon III. Oops. You don't want to have that happen. So the king will be ransomed eventually, but Bismarck is not going to stop at Sedan and the victory. He's got his army. He's going to want to make sure that France is not going to bother him on the border. And so he's going to march on Paris. So this is the fall of 1870. Well, the parliament that had been under Napoleon III and the elite leaders of the city of Paris don't want to get in the way of the German army. And so they leave. They declare the city open so that the Prussian army can just walk right in and take control over it, with the hopes that they can negotiate a peace later on and get Paris back. However, the people of Paris and much of the military is not going to want to give up the city that quickly, especially not to the Prussians. And so they start an insurrectionist movement in Paris. This holds out until the spring of 1871. This moment is called the Paris Commune. Paris has no leadership. They've all left. The Prussian army surrounds them, and the people of Paris are determined to fight to the last person. It's a moment that is celebrated by all sorts of groups, especially communist groups, because they feel that this is a predecessor of the communists. It is a bloody battle because it's house-to-house fighting, urban warfare. Barricades are built, and actually the barricades are so big and so impressive that they have their pictures taken on the barricades, because we have cameras, more people with cameras running around. And sadly, when the Prussians finally win and they put down this insurrection, they're going to use the photographs to identify the leaders of the Paris Commune and execute them. So they are found guilty by photograph. This is one of the first uses of photographs in that way. And I mean, they're going to execute hundreds of people, line them up on the wall and shoot them. It is quite an intense moment for France. But the Prussian army makes it to Versailles, which is west of the city of Paris, and they take over the palace. This is Louis XIV's palace. This is Versailles. This is the absolute symbol of French royal splendor. And the crowd of victorious Prussian and other German military men gather, and they declare the German Reich, or Regency. Well, not Regency, I'm sorry, Empire. Reich is empire. And they declare King William I as Kaiser Wilhelm. Kaiser is a German form of the word Caesar, the old Roman emperors. So they declare the Second Reich. The First Reich had been under Barbarossa a few hundred years before. But this painting is the crowning of Kaiser Wilhelm I as the Kaiser, the Emperor of Germany. And you will note a couple of interesting features of this painting. Here is the Great Hall of Mirrors. Here are the battle standards that had been won. And one of the most, and of course, here is the Kaiser. And here is Bismarck, the man who got him there. And you will note there's not a civilian in the group. These are all high military officers, the top, who are imposing Germany from on top. It's kind of a fascinating picture. It's certainly a middle finger to the French by the Germans to basically crown their emperor in Versailles, number one, and that's going to come back to haunt them in a few years. But the idea of all of this splendor is entirely justified by hard power, by violence, by war, by military conquest is what's truly going to get them there. So it is a very unusual moment for Germany. So we see Germany is united on this date with Wilhelm I as their Kaiser. Bismarck will stay on in power for a few more years. So France, because they lost the war, is going to give the Alsace-Lorraine, which is the easternmost part of France, the westernmost part of Germany, to Germany. And France is going to be forced to pay indemnity, 5 billion francs is going to have to be paid by France to Germany as a promise they will not attack Germany again. So that the Franco-Prussian War, fairly brief war, it's decisively won by the Prussians, and they declare themselves the new German Empire. Okay. So moving on very briefly to one of the last of the powers in Europe, way in the east, the Russian state. Russia had been, since at least the time of Peter the Great, 150 years before this moment, had been of two minds. And those minds are the Slavophiles and the Westernizers. The Slavophiles wanted to keep Russia as a distinctive culture. They idealized Russian culture and the peasants out on the farms. And they hated Western secularism, commercialism, and what they saw as bourgeois culture. They didn't want factories. They didn't want all of the trappings that went with a liberal democracy or anything like that. They wanted to stay as they always had been, with the Tsar on top, and everyone else knowing their place. The Westernizers are looking at Russia as backwards. They want to bring in European science and technology and education, and they like liberalism. They appreciate individual rights. And if you're going to be for individual rights, there's one group of people that have been left out of this whole equation, and that's the serfs. Russia had serfs for a very long time. These were people who were not slaves. They were peasants who were tied to the land and could not leave. Or they could basically be ordered around by whoever owned the land. So whoever owned the land, the people came with it, and the people worked on their lord's land. Or consequently, if that particular prince, because there were a lot of princes in Russia, had opened up a factory, and a few of them did, they could order their serfs to merely go work in the factory. Also, many of these princes and the nobility of Russia served various offices in the government, or they served in the military, or both. Now, a lot of the nobility, a few of the nobility thought that serfdom should end because they valued individual rights. And someone being physically tied to the land goes against the concept of individual rights. But most of the nobility opposed emancipation of the serfs for a simple reason. That's how they made money. Also, a serf, they could borrow money based on how many serfs they had. Now, these were giant sections of land. And so in order to work them and in order to earn money to be a noble, they had these giant areas where these peasants worked them. So they were at an impasse. The nobles wanted to keep their land and keep the people working on it and not have to pay them. Or the nobles could take the land and kick all the serfs off and bring in people to work the land and modernize it and everything. But then the serfs would be without land. How do you support these groups? Also, with that idea of serfdom, Russia looked like a very, very backwards country. And in fact, it would be compared to another large country that everyone in Europe knew about that had slaves, the United States. So the Crimean War that I talked about last week definitely had forced Russia's hand. Russia had been fighting against the Turks, and you had France and England coming in on the side of Russia, but on the Turks, but Russia looked like a weak individual, a weak country, because they couldn't supply their troops. They had very backwards sort of technology, and so they had to do something. Russia had to do something in order to improve their lot. And so the Tsar, who at this time was Alexander II, is going to decide to liberate the serfs. I hadn't talked about the Crimean War. I blocked it out. All right. I'm sorry. Let us take a break until 8 o'clock. I will be coming back to finish up this chapter. You are welcome to chat if you like, but I will mute my microphone. So we'll be back at 8 o'clock. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. All right, I had confused myself. Well, it's easy to do, because I hadn't talked about the Crimean War yet. My brain was thinking chronologically and was already in 1872, and whoops. Our chapter deviates, or our book deviates a little bit in this chapter. You have lived through a time, and I hope you all can hear me. You have lived through a time where the Crimea is important again. But when this war happened, this Crimean War happened in 1853, it was a very important international moment. It was, as usual, framed as a Christians versus Ottoman Muslims sort of affair, but that shouldn't blind you to the fact that it was a land grab by Russia. Russia has, for a very long time, wanted to move to gain enough land to get them to a warm water port. Russia has ports on the Baltic Sea. Russia has ports on the Arctic Ocean, and Russia has ports on the Pacific Ocean, namely Vladivostok. And the ports that they had, Vladivostok, Arkhangelsk, which is in the Arctic Circle, and the Baltic ports, none of those ports are entirely free of ice during the winter. And I'll tell you about Vladivostok and Arkhangelsk in a little bit, another couple of chapters. But the Russians, ever since Peter the Great, wanted to have a navy in a warm water port. And it's still kind of that way. And the closest warm water port was the Black Sea, which was under control of the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks. They had controls over places like Moldavia and Wallachia, which is nowadays Moldova and Romania, and the Ottoman, the Crimean Peninsula, which until a couple years ago was Ukrainian. Anyway, so in 1853, the Russians are eager to get Crimea and a warm water port, especially because the dream was to connect that warm water port with the agricultural areas of Ukraine and be able to take grain out through the Black Sea and then into the Mediterranean. To do this, the Russians needed to clear the Ottomans away from Crimea, which is a very well-developed port. Other areas around the Black Sea, not so much as far as building a port, but Crimea was the good port. And so the Russians are going to invade the Ottoman territories of Moldavia and Wallachia and beat the Turkish fleet at Sinope. The British and French, even though they are Christian, like the Russians, the British and French are going to declare war on Russia, in essence taking the side of the Ottoman Turks. This is problematic because fighting with the Ottoman Turks was not considered a good idea because they were not Christian. But whatever it took to beat Russia and stop Russian expansion, as long as Russia did not have a warm water port, France and Britain did not have to worry about Russia launching a giant navy to take them over or taking over trade. So the British and the French are going to be sending troops there and fighting with the Turks and the troops of Piedmont, Sardinia. Remember, this is before we have a nation of Italy. And it's going to be rather bad for the Russians, for the French, for the British, and the Turks. They're all going to mismanage this war. It's going to be a mess. And especially because they're going to get massive outbreaks of typhus and cholera. It will also be a war that will be very large battles, but because the Russians did not have good arms, neither did the Turks, we're going to have large battles settled by bayonets. Other powers feared Russia, not because they had an army that was frighteningly well trained or well equipped. The army of Russia was not that. The Russian army was something to be afraid of because they could put 1 million men in the field to fight. And if you're your average European power, you've got maybe 100,000 at the max at this moment. And even 1 million men with sticks is a frightening concept. So the Russians, even though they're not going to be doing very well, are going to make sure that the French, the British, and the Turks don't get a good, decisive victory. So the French, the British, and the Turks can't claim land from Russia afterwards. So here is Crimea and the Black Sea. Here's the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, and you've got the British and the French sailing through the Dardanelles Pass, sailing through Istanbul, coming up here into Wallachia and Moldavia, and using that, pardon me, as a launching point to fight in Crimea. So it is going to show, this war is going to show that the Ottoman Empire was a fairly weak empire, that the British were not very well prepared because they did not have a professional officer corps. The Russians, same problem and well understaffed, and the French were not doing as well. So the really poor management by Great Britain and Russia, the peace settlement meant that Russia did not have as much influence in the Balkans. Here's where some students get confused. These are the Balkans here: Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, Albania. Many of these countries, Bulgaria, many of these countries are Slavic in their language and ethnicity. And so Russia saw themselves as their protector, but they are lost after this war back to the Ottoman Empire. So the ideas of freeing these people from the Ottoman Empire doesn't work out for Russia. Romania as a nation is formed in this war. Before, it had never been an independent nation. Is Albania Slavic? Good question, Marco. The Albanian culture is not per se Slavic. They are a very interesting group that I don't know a lot about, but culturally, they have a different language than everybody there. They have very different cultural customs. They have, I believe, I don't know what branch of Christianity they are, but Albania is very different from all of its neighbors. Even under, in the Cold War, it had some differences. So it's the Balkan area is an area that's fascinating to study because there are so many differences in their groups. So yeah, I can't, Marco, I can't answer your question other to say they are ethnically and language-wise different than their neighbors. So Austria did not get in this war. They are one of the few groups in Europe that did not get in this war. And this meant that their alliance with Russia was in danger. A lot of this area that was being fought over during the Crimean War was actually in Austrian hands as well. But it was a war that saw that modern warfare, the nations who wanted to fight in modern warfare needed to step up. Number one, they had to have a better group of surgeons and medical people to help them, because most of the deaths from the Crimean War on all the sides was from disease, not from actual fighting. This is not unusual in early wars. But there was also a interesting group of technologies that are going to come to the forefront. Railroads, to get men and material back and forth faster than they could by ship, although the British and the French definitely wanted to send their troops by ship, because railroads can only go in certain places and they're well known, but a ship can land in various other places. So the British felt that it was safer to take their troops by ship. Another innovation, the telegraph. Now, electricity hadn't been invented yet, so these telegraphs were run by very primitive batteries. We had batteries long before we had electricity, Leyden jars and the like. So these telegraphs were able to get the information very quickly from the battlefront back to the commanding officers back home. It wasn't instantaneous, and the messages tended to be short and a lot of times garbled, but the telegraph was there. We also had the camera, and they were sending photographers like Roger Fenton to take pictures of the war where we had not seen, unless you were on the battlefield yourself, you did not see what these battles were like. And so people back home for the first time eventually could see these war photographs. Now, the photographs still had to travel, they couldn't travel electronically, but they could at least see pictures from the battlefield. Also, the efforts to have a real medical corps is going to take off. But however, this is the war that saw the charge of the Light Brigade, which is going to really show up the fact that the British needed to have more professional training for their officer corps, because the officer corps had been mainly noblemen who had, for the most part, inherited their or purchased their ranks and were open up to petty squabbles. The Light Brigade was wiped out almost totally because of two noblemen who hated each other's guts. So one of the noblemen ordered the other one to lead a suicide charge. So yeah, you've got to correct for that in modern warfare. And I had for the people who were studying warfare, I had them look at some of the photos of Roger Fenton's photos from the Crimean War and compare them to the photographs taken just 10 years later by Matthew Brady of the American Civil War. I found 2 websites that they could compare, and I haven't looked at your replies yet. Did anybody notice any differences in these photographs? One important difference was that Fenton took a lot of pictures of living soldiers, whereas Matthew Brady was not afraid to take his equipment out on the battlefield and photograph dead soldiers, which to our eyes would be terribly shocking. It tells a very different story when you're showing living soldiers in their nice uniforms, even though some of the shots that Roger Fenton took were soldiers missing arms or legs, had been wounded severely. They were still in uniform and still looking okay, but seeing the bodies in the battlefield was something Matthew Brady took pictures of, and that was somewhat shocking to the people of the time. They weren't quite prepared for that. Now, for us, oftentimes, this kind of photography fills us kind of with a sense of pity and the horrors of war, whereas Roger Fenton's pictures, because you're not seeing the devastation as much, they weren't as horrible. But I don't think the people who saw Matthew Brady's photographs of the American Civil War were that horrified by the deaths. To me, the sense of sacrifice by the families, both of the North and the South, of losing their sons in battle, I think was overridden by a revulsion that they might feel at seeing the dead bodies. But understanding what they had done was a definite sacrifice. Okay. That is the end of that chapter. Does anyone have any questions?
Professor, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I want to start working on the assignment, which is due date by by 1st of the month, August of 1st.
Yes.
So I want to do it, and I will email you to give me your feedback.
Yes.
Thank
Yes.
you. Yes, I will let you know.
Oh, if you will notice on the module for the assignment, I have put my manuscript submission style sheet. That is a sheet that basically tells you what the paper should look like.
But it's hard when I found it. It was
Yes.
hard.
To understand?
No.
Oh.
So I spent more time finding this, how I could find the file. I found it on the module chapter 5, I think.
Oh, module number 5, yes.
Oh.
Yeah, always go to the modules first to find these things.
Yeah.
If you have to take a quiz and you go to quizzes, sometimes I have to work up quizzes that I don't have, or I have place keepers or whatever. So always go to the modules first.
Okay. So do we have extra credit?
No.
No.
Okay. All right. Then I would like to keep going at least for a little while and get the next chapter started. Thank you. All right. All right. So, imperialism and colonialism. This particular chapter, I will warn you ahead of time, is extremely disturbing. We will be talking about issues of race and colonization and science and social Darwinism and some very cruel things that happened over the course of this colonialization. So I'm just going to warn you ahead of time. It is a very, I don't want to say meaningful or important, but it is an explanatory concept because it shows a sense of superiority and cruelty that the Europeans had, and they tried to justify it, and that's where it just to our minds, I think it just makes it worse than just saying we're here to profit from these people. So what do we mean by imperialism? It means the process of extending one state's control over another state. And there's a couple of different kinds of imperialism. There's direct rule, that you send in your military or branch of the service, you annex all the territories, you subjugate the inhabitants, and you put your people in charge of them. So basically you are an occupying force. And then once you occupy, you work very hard to take everything out of value out of that new state that you have annexed. There's indirect rule, or basically it's like the beginning of direct rule, in which you annex territories, a kingdom or a country comes in and annexes another territory, but they allow local leaders to govern. So they put a hand-picked group on top and support them militarily, etc. There's also a type of informal imperialism, which allows that weaker state to maintain its independence, but reducing its sovereignty. Basically, you are a couple of ways of doing this is by going into a country, paying off its leadership, promising them a cut of the profits you make, and then you just basically go ahead and take whatever the country wants to take. I'm thinking recent illustrations are oil in, is it Nigeria? Or oil along the western coast of Africa, where the leaders of the countries have oil companies coming in. They give them rights to drill. The oil companies bring in their own people to do the drilling, and they take the oil, and then they pay the ruling parties of the country a certain amount of money. And that way they get to take whatever they want to. But what's going to happen in the 19th century is not just an occasional colony here and there. It is Europeans carving out zones of influence. Literally, old people plus maps equals trouble. This is my 9th rule of surviving Western civilization. Old people plus maps equals trouble. Because the... Pardon?
They also draw really straight lines.
Yes, that the people...
Good old Sykes-Picot.
Yeah, the people carving up these areas are doing it without any knowledge of the area, generally speaking, without any concept of what's there, without any sympathy at all for the people who actually live there. And so you get a very awful sort of experience. So between, in 27 very short years, the Europeans seize 90% of Africa. So that's a very short amount of time for a very big continent. Now, when we say seize, that doesn't mean absolutely control or actually populate or actually get there. But they basically carve up Africa, and you take that part, and you take that part, and I want my part to look like a diamond, that sort of thing. So in that end of the 19th century, a handful of European states colonize a quarter of the world's lands. I mean, we leave Antarctica out of it, but other than that, there is an amazing amount of colonization. And this imperialism is basically empire building. Putting your power over another area so that you can monopolize its resources and take them to benefit the home country. So this, pardon me, map is in your book, and it shows who got what colony. And you can see Africa is all cut up. And you can see the kind of reddish burgundy color in New Zealand, in Australia, in parts of Indonesia, India, along the spine of Africa, and Canada, and South America. Those are all British. That the boast by the British Empire was the sun never sets on the British Empire, that there's always the sunlight in some portion of the British Empire. And they could do this because of their naval superiority. To which the Irish would answer, yes, the sun never sets on the British Empire because even God himself would not trust those bastards after dark. There's not a
Technically,
lot
because
of-
the Brits have held on to a bunch of islands, the sun has yet to set on the British Empire.
Yeah, yeah. Oof. But at least Australia's independent. So is New Zealand. So is India. So as strange as it sounds, I mean, we can see easily that industrialization is they're going to need raw materials. And so going in and taking them just seems to be a way to negotiate this problem of we need this continuous input of raw materials. Liberal revolutions and the rise of nation states, that's a weird one, because if you were following the principles of classic liberalism, wouldn't it be right for all of these colonies to in fact be their own nation state, ruled by their own people, their destiny is determined by themselves, and that trade for these goods, these raw materials, should be between partners rather than demanded by the home country. Now, the justification in many ways was progress. We will see that this progress was not actually helping the colonies in certain ways. It was also justified, the progress was not just material progress, but spiritual progress. In many of these areas, religious missions were set up, and without any concern for how the people in these areas felt. But these missions were considered an important part of this process. The resistance and rebellion by these colonies, and yes, many of them did rebel, and many of them did fight, meant that the colonizers had to have better and better and better weapons. So it becomes this buildup over time. So more of this idea of settlement and discipline. In other words, send in a lot of troops and use harsh measures to get what you want, rather than actually trading with these people as equals. And so the organization of these interactions and these relationships are going to affect us even today, how certain groups look at certain other groups. And even today, we see the scars that this colonization and imperialization happened. And one of the ways that the people of Europe saw colonization, yes, they saw some of the goods coming in, but they also saw brief glimpses of the culture. And they imagined the cultures to be so different than what they actually are. Or anthropologist Clifford Geertz talks about levels of understanding in anthropologists and people who go into cultures to try to understand them. And there is the understanding that you see the visual aspects, or maybe even hear the visual aspects of the culture and assume that you know about it because you've seen it and heard it. But you really don't understand the underlying reason why they're doing this. So it's a very shallow understanding that these people have about these different cultures. And so what they see in cultures is fashion, is maybe music, food, just a handful of aspects, but they really don't understand the depths of the culture because they can't speak the language. They don't know the spiritual history sometimes of these groups, etc. And many times the tales that are going to come back are going to be the salacious ones. If someone is a soldier that served overseas or had worked for one of the companies that had colonies overseas, you would come back with tales and with souvenirs. You're not going to tell them about every day. You know, if you're sitting around a dinner table or in a bar or having tea, you're not going to talk about just the everyday happenings. You're going to talk about the most salacious things. You're going to talk about the things that are going to shock your audience, such as in certain parts of India, it was said that widows throw themselves on the funeral pyres of their husbands. Now, maybe this happened once or twice, but to the European imagination, this is just something that happened, not understanding all of the depths of meaning. So consequently, people learning about what's happening in the colonies oftentimes get a very distorted view of what's happening in the colonies and not finding about the real happenings on the ground. But believe me, the people who are colonized certainly know what's happening. So, India, known as the jewel of the British crown. India had been, over the millennia, one of the first areas that civilization starts in the Indus River Valley. And it had developed in its own way. It had become, it had its own culture, its own sets of languages, and it's a large area with a lot of people. So it's very wrong to describe it as being one way. But it had certain things that governments in Europe wanted. Now, mostly people talk about tea. And yes, and spices, and cotton, but there was something else that was in India that was of very little interest to industry or individuals, but something that states and governments wanted a lot of, and that was gunpowder. India had, in the Bihar region, had naturally occurring deposits of potassium nitrate, the main ingredient in gunpowder. And whoever controlled this supply could control who got gunpowder. In other words, if you had a monopoly on this potassium nitrate, you could starve your enemies for gunpowder. It was a very simple way of establishing a victory over your enemies. The French, of course, are going to get stuck in this position of the British blockading their gunpowder. Even before the French Revolution, going back to the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, which were wars between Britain and France. They needed a lot of gunpowder. The French turned to one of their great chemists, a man by the name of Lavoisier, who devised how to create potassium nitrate so they could create their own. Was heralded as a big hero by the French government for being able to do this. Sadly, he was then executed during the Reign of Terror, during the French Revolution. But his assistant, Émile Dupont, learned the secrets, and his family immigrated to the United States. And during the buildup to the Civil War, this family noticed that the quality of American gunpowder was particularly bad. So the DuPont family created a gunpowder or a chemical manufacturing firm. And it's still around, the DuPont factory. So they started with making gunpowder. Anyway, I'm way off topic. So the British did not rule physically as a kingdom in India. They had a monopoly company called the British East India Company that ruled or was in charge of India. And it was a private company. It was a corporation, limited corporation, but it had been given a license by the Crown of England to do business there. It had to protect itself because it was overseas and there was rebellion going on. So they had to build their own private army. And they basically tried to control everything that was happening in India. They had a very repressive military government that ruled with an extraordinarily heavy hand. They taxed the colony as well as taking the resources from it. And they played the various elites of India one against the other in order to make sure that they kept on top. So the East India Company was a corporation run amok, in other words. They had divided up India. They had allowed certain people to rule in certain other parts. They had taken over parts themselves. This is literally a map of a underside of the continent that has no real appreciation for what's going on in all of these different areas. But the way you control things is you have a map. And so this is basically how they divided these places up. However, the British East India Company is not going to do well, and they will be unable to put up with certain mutinies, especially the Great Mutiny of 1857, where the troops that had been hired by the East India Company refused to use the rifle cartridges because they had been kept from rusting on and eroding and corroding on the trip from England to India by being greased with pork fat. And that and those soldiers who were adherents to various um, religious traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism wouldn't have anything, and Islam wouldn't have anything to do with pork fat. So this is kind of a base justification for this mutiny. It's not because all of a sudden they saw the pork fat and went crazy. It had been building for years and years and years. There were social and economic and political grievances that lead up to this. But when the history is written soon afterwards, the British are going to blame it on the pork fat. They're not going to talk a lot about the other things that happened. It was a very simple justification. So the Great Mutiny of 1857, soldiers go on strikes and peasants burn the tax rolls and attack the court and get rid of the paperwork in order to protest the debt and the corruption of the East India Company, because it had become extremely corrupt, but it also had its own military. So it became quite apparent that the British East India Company would, in fact, lead, if they did not clean up their ways, it would mean that Great Britain would lose India. There had also been Christian missionaries sent to India, and those had been opposed by the leaders already there. The British answer to all of this was a campaign of repression, a campaign of terror against the rebellion, forcing people to move, destroying villages, a very ruthless sort of reaction to these violence. And those who led the rebellion were executed in a particularly visually shocking way. In other words, they were tied up to the front of cannons and then the cannons were fired off. And you can probably guess the results. So after 1857, there needs to be something done to bring the company under control and to ensure the flow of goods. And so the British government is going to abolish the East India Company and replace it with the British Crown. So we see true state-run colonization. This is a cartoon that ran after the mutiny, the rebellion of 1857, and this kind of figure represents the East India House, the East India Trading Company, and it's being executed by cannons, but you can see it's got a joker's hat, and all of the pieces of its body that are being blown away are the things that it did wrong. So avarice, blundering, nepotism, misgovernment, and of course, my favorite, supineness, which is an old-fashioned word. Anyway, so the British take over. Certain parts of India they will rule directly as the Raj system, and other parts they will have the local princes rule them subject to British advisors. So they're not going to be entirely on their own. So the military is going to be totally reorganized. Indigenous troops are going to be separated. So troops from the Bombay region and troops from Bihar and troops from Bengal and troops from Goa, they will not serve in organized units. They will serve apart from each other. Another way that the British want to cement their rule in India is to open up the civil service, the bureaucracy of running this colony in India to Indian upper classes. So the wealthy of India get a chance to move up and be politically active and connected. Also, the British toned down the missionary activity. They don't get rid of it entirely, but they do attempt to minimize it. So India was, until its independence, Britain's largest export market. India provided the British Empire with laborers, professionals, students, workers, and 1.2 million Indian troops fought with the British in the trenches in World War I and various other places. So as a colony, they were heavily invested in by Britain, but they also became an important part of Great Britain. When I lived in Prague, there were a lot of expats running around, people who were collecting unemployment in Great Britain, but living in Prague because it was cheaper. But they would have to go home every so often to collect their unemployment checks. And I'm telling this story because I was talking to some of them over a beer, and they said we can't wait to get back to Great Britain to get some of that delicious British food. And me not knowing only a little bit about British food said, what delicious British food? And they said, well, of course, curry, pompadums, tikka masala. all the food they were talking about was Indian food. And of course, I also talked about Pakistani food, and so that influence is in Great Britain. Also, in creating an indirect rule, they wanted those people in India who were under indirect rule to serve British interests. In other words, to be familiar with Great Britain and be more than willing to trade with them. And so to do this, many bright young men were brought to Great Britain to study in their universities, in Oxford, at Cambridge, and learn basically law or what they needed to learn, and take that education back to India to help their own people. In fact, Mahatma Gandhi was an Indian who was educated in Great Britain and became a lawyer and then came back to India. So there was a large group of these Indians who were trained in Great Britain and ruled in the Raj. So another focus of the Europeans in terms of imperialism and colonization was China. Now, if you remember 101 and you remember the Silk Road and the Mongol Empire and all the Europeans wanting the silk and the goods that they could get from China. And of course, China was not interested in what the Europeans had except for gold. And so China became this symbolic trading partner that was always very standoffish. And Europe wanted to get into China, but the Chinese resisted for a very long time. This is a great little political cartoon, and it's got the giant egg of China, and it has the European powers as chickens trying to sit on it so that it will hatch. You've got, here's Franz Josef of the Austrian Empire. Here's the Tsar of Russia. Here's Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. I believe this is the Belgian king. We've got the Italian sitting back here. Oh no, that's Great Britain. Sorry about that. So you've got all these chickens trying to sit on the egg of China to hatch it so they could get what's in it. And of course, back here you've got the rooster, that is Uncle Sam, looking on, eager to see what's going to happen. So China closed its ports to Europeans. The Europeans would force their way in. And so China, just for self-preservation, opened up ports under treaties with the Europeans, where the Europeans lived under their own jurisdiction, which is basically Hong Kong was the last holdout. Hong Kong was a British city. It was under a 100-year lease, and in 1999 that lease was up, and the British gave it back. So another aspect of the Europeans trying to move in was establish missionary activity in China. Was a big destiny for missionary work. And the British, above all, wanted to improve China trade. That was something that they dearly and desperately wanted. And the Chinese worked very hard to keep them out. Because Great Britain did not want to spend money in China to get what they wanted, because that would be treating them like an equal partner. And there was very little that the Chinese wanted to give the British. And so the British find an insidious back door into China. And that's what's known as the opium trade. Opium grows in India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc. Opium is actually the sap of a poppy, the flower. When it's in bud, the bud is very carefully cut, and the sap runs out, and the sap is collected. So you can imagine you get a quarter of a teaspoon, a half a teaspoon maybe, out of every bud. So I'm hoping that you're imagining, you know, a quarter of a teaspoon that gets cooked down into a very small amount that becomes opium, which is a narcotic, which is highly, highly addictive. And what the British work out is that they will have their colony in India manufacture opium. Some of the opium will go to Europe because it was a narcotic. It was very popular as a cure-all, but most of the opium would be shipped by Indian ships into China. And it was sold as a way to exchange it for the goods that Great Britain wanted out of China. So it becomes this triangular trade. So Northeast India starts becoming rich off of the opium trade, and people in China are now addicted to opium, which means they have to keep buying more and more. This is an opium factory. Now remember I said each little poppy produced a tiny amount? These are solid chunks of opium that would then be shipped to China. The just massive amounts are mind-bending. So it became something of a narco-military empire. And that opium production, it was extremely labor-intensive, but it was very profitable. So this triangular trade develops. East India Company ships opium to Southeast Asia and China. Silver that was the opium was sold for was used to buy Chinese goods for the European market. Eventually, China will ban imports of opium, and so the British will lose their toehold in China, setting up for all sorts of problems. So here's where the triangular trade. So it comes out of India, goes into China, is exchanged, and comes back into Europe. So it's going to touch off several opium wars that China will be fighting to keep Great Britain out. The drugs were not necessarily the focus. It was more about keeping the British out and keeping Chinese sovereignty on top. And the Europeans were fighting to get to trade with China, as strange as that sounds. The Treaty of Nanking, which ends this war, means that the British get certain trading privileges. As I said, Hong Kong, in some places, the port of Hong Kong is given to them in perpetuity, but I remember at the time hearing that it had then been given as a lease. That's not enough for the British, and the second Opium War starts. The British want further rights into China, including the right to send in missionaries. So Great Britain was willing to fight yet another war to be able to send in missionaries to convert the Chinese to Christianity. That's how serious they were about it. But other countries wanted in too. They saw Great Britain was making headway and they wanted to become part of it too. The French, the Germans, and the Russians are going to attempt to get mining rights in China. The borders of China have some interesting mining capabilities, and the idea of manufacturing with Chinese labor, because there was so much Chinese labor available. The United States is also going to practice what they call gunboat diplomacy by insisting that China opens its doors to trade with the United States, which is a little problematic because there in America, we had shut down any sort of immigration with China. The history of the Chinese the exclusionary acts is a particularly awful part of American history. It's going to lead directly to such things as the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. But in the 19th century, they were just trying to exclude Chinese coming to America. And you can see by this great editorial cartoon, you have the Japanese, the French, here's Marianne, Tsar of Russia, Kaiser Wilhelm, and Queen Victoria chopping up the pie that is China. And I think this is the most fascinating individual here. I mean, we're used to seeing Europeans, but Japanese. The Japanese will take after the European model. They will send observers to Europe. There will be Japanese observers in many of the wars of the 19th and 20th century from Japan, taking notes. And so Japan is convinced that they can keep the colonizers out. And they will basically build up their military so that they are strong enough to keep the colonizers, the European colonizers, out. But they have to test this idea, and so they're going to go to war with China. It's called the Sino-Japanese War. Sino means Chinese, and they force China to trade with Japan. They also get the independence for Korea on the Liaotung Peninsula in Manchuria. This is going to set up a Japanese foothold in Manchuria, where they will start the state of Manchukuo. And by the 1930s, Japan will move into China in a very big way, but I'll talk about that later. There will be resistance in China, most notably by a group that called themselves the Righteous Harmonious Fists. They were a secret society of a militia that was trained in martial arts. The Europeans called them boxers, and so this Chinese rebellion is called the Boxer Rebellion. That the Society of Righteous Harmonious Fists were against foreigners being in China, and especially against missionaries. And they spent a great deal of time doing guerrilla warfare against railways and against mining operations. Eventually, they will put the basic European councils and embassies under attack in Beijing and hold them basically hostage for several months. And the American Marines and British Marines have to come in and rescue them. One interesting thing to note is that one of the Americans that was near Beijing at the time, who was being held under siege by the Boxers, was a man who would become president of the United States, Herbert Hoover, and his wife. He was a trained mining engineer, and he had been looking for gold in China. He was one of these Westerners who was trying to extract resources out of China. And he wrote extensively about being under siege and made jokes about his wife, Louis, who they basically ran out of food. and they had to resort to eating their horses. And then they started starving to death, but the Marines got to them in time. But President Hoover used to joke about what his wife could do with horse flesh for dinner. Anyway, but while they were there, one of the things, Bert Hoover was extraordinarily rich. And so while he was in China, he purchased Ming vases. Ming vases that were 4, 5, 6 feet tall. These were the finest of Chinese pottery, and he had them shipped back to the United States. And they are on display at Stanford University. But it started the craze in the United States for collecting Ming china and Ming porcelain and Chinese porcelain. Anyway, I'm off track. So the great powers are going to have to send in the military to rescue their people, but also put down the boxers. And it's going to show that the colonies are not as secure as the Europeans wanted to pretend, but at the same time that the colonists are willing to do anything to keep their powers, their empires in power. So I'm going to stop here. That's the beginning of imperialism, early parts of imperialism in just Asia. I have only been talking about India and China. We still have another continent or two to go. And what happens in Africa is going to make things that happened in China and India in the 19th century look like child's play. So, does anyone have any questions for me?
I do have a question, but it's disregarding from like what today's lecture was over.
Sure.
So I just want to clarify, on the Canvas, I received a notification saying that the assignment tomorrow was due at 4, but then later on in the day, I received another notification saying it was due at midnight. So I wasn't sure which time it was due at.
I might have put the wrong time on it and then changed it. So it's due at midnight.
Midnight? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Oh, so you haven't posted the quiz for chapter 20?
No,
Right.
I'm gonna post those tomorrow so that we can have a discussion on this next Tuesday.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and they will be due before class on Tuesday.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
So, Professor, I have a question. So, chapter 22, we haven't finished it.
No, I have not finished it. I still have quite a bit of it to go, and I will put up discussion questions for the class, and those will be due before class on Tuesday. So I'll get them in as soon as I can.
What about quiz 21?
Yep, we're going to have a quiz on 20 and 21. I have to get that out as well.
So this is due date when?
Oh, I will be watching when I post it. I will try to give you 7 days after I post it to finish those quizzes.
So like before class before class starts?
No, well, for the quizzes, no. They're going, I will give you 7 days after I post them. So if I post them tomorrow, then they won't be due until a week from tomorrow.
Okay, so we have time.
Okay, you have time. Yeah. All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Have a good night.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Good night, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Good night.